Now we talk about Roman numeral 4, workers and strikes and how all of that was affected and so forth. People moved to the cities in huge numbers during this period. There's a movement of about 8 to 9 million people into urban areas during this period of time. A lot of them came from from farming communities, again, because the land had sort of gone poor from the destroyed South. But a lot of them were also immigrants into the country. The immigrants came over heavily because of the Contract Labor Act of 1864. The Contract Labor Act of 1864 allowed for businesses to enter into contracts with immigrants and basically pay their way to the United States. They would say, again, essentially in exchange for paying your entry into the country, you have to work in our factory for 4 or 5 years. It was an effective way to get workers. Other reasons why people came to these areas, again, you've got poor farms, you've got the destroyed South. You also have a lot of children in the workplace during this period of time. As we'll talk about, there's a lot of everyone in the family in the workplace as well. But again, the main reasons you're going is just because of opportunity. This is where the jobs are in the factories and so forth. Life in the factory was not particularly pleasant during this period. In fact, a lot of the work in the factories was sort of mind-numbingly boring, grinding work. This is partly because of a new technique that was discovered, the idea of piecework. They broke down tasks into pieces. They took a complex thing, like, say, making a chair, and instead of having one worker make a chair, they instead broke it down into each step involved. Someone making the legs, someone making the arms, someone making the back, someone gluing it together, someone painting it, etc. And each of those tasks was then refined and reformed until it could be as efficient as possible. The person who took this idea and sort of wrote it down was called Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor is the gentleman who writes The Principles of Scientific Management in 1911. The Principles of Scientific Management. In this book, he basically lays out the most efficient way to create a workplace, the most efficient way to create a factory, and so forth. And this creates the concept of the division of labor. Division of labor basically takes piecemeal or piecework to its logical extension, which is rather than having one person perform multiple tasks to create one finished product, you hire multiple people to perform multiple tasks to do the same product. So rather than having one guy make the legs, make the arms, make the back, glue the chair, paint the chair, install the chair, each of those 6 tasks gets one person to do it, one repetitive job. This is much more efficient, but unfortunately division of labor also makes it much more boring, much more soul-crushing. Think about what your job, what it would be like if you had to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It basically turned people into machines. In fact, this is where the term robot comes from. The term robot was a Polish term referring to a man who acts like a machine. And this is where the term first gets applied, because that's what you're doing. You're making them act more and more and more and more and more like a machine rather than, again, an individual. It also gets rid of artistry and so forth. So craftsmen, people who are skilled at doing one thing extremely well, get pushed out for cheap labor. A lot of this cheap labor, again, came in the form of immigrants, but a lot of it also comes from women and children. A lot of the women and children were cheap labor. In fact, children oftentimes left school at the age of 12 to go work in the factories. They made up 5% of total labor. In some industries, they were much, much higher. For example, children were very commonly used in mines because they were smaller, and therefore you didn't have to make the mine shaft as big. I wish I was kidding, but really that's what they would do. So picture the 5th grade and picture shoving them into a coal mine because that's what they did. Part of the reason for this is there is no unemployment insurance or anything during this time period. So if dad is working in a factory and gets his arm cut off or gets injured or heck just has a bad day, you're not getting paid for it. If he gets fired, you're not getting paid. If he loses a limb, you're not getting paid. So the wife and the children will oftentimes have to go to work in order to help make up the difference. Women's labor at this period is also increased, working primarily in textile mills. They're working in large, full-scale factories that are producing cloth and so forth. The problem is that while all of this is very, very, very productive, it's also, again, soul-crushing and painful, and it's also not exactly equal. At this point in time, the equality is 9% of the U.S. held 75% of the wealth. This is what they're talking about like now. They're talking about like 1% owns 99% globally. At this point, it's 9% and 75%, which is still pretty bad, especially given what we had in the country at that point. So this is a pretty unequal distribution. As a result, you see the rise of labor unions. Labor unions are organizations where workers join forces in an effort to get better working conditions. And some of the big ones that popped up during this period, you have the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, often just abbreviated just the Knights of Labor, but still it's a fun name. The Noble Order of the Knights of Labor was created in 1869 by a man named Terence Powderly. Powderly, it's another fun name that you should, try to bring back some fun time. Terence Powderly. The idea of the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor is that they welcomed all workers from all walks of life to join forces. And together, not only would they reform business, but they would reform society as well, get rid of the evils of things like drinking and smoking and child abandonment, etc., etc., etc. It was never a terribly successful union. While the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor was big, it was never terribly successful, simply because it was too big, it was too unwieldy. By welcoming members from all walks of life, the problem was they had nothing in common. Because issues that carpenters cared about were not the same issues that tradesmen cared about, or not issues that, the dock workers cared about, not issues that the railroad workers cared about, etc. By welcoming everybody into the pool, then nobody got what they wanted. Much more successful would be the American Federation of Labor, otherwise known as the AFL. The American Federation of Labor was created by Samuel Gompers. Again, this chapter is just full of awesome names. Samuel Gompers instead focused on smaller unions, like smaller forces and so forth. Skilled laborers. So they welcomed skilled carpenters and skilled electricians and eventually and so forth. And whereas the Knights of Labor focused on social issues, the American Federation of Labor was much more focused on business issues only. So they focused on things like wages and collective bargaining. Collective bargaining was a technique created by the AFL, or at least credited to the AFL. Collective bargaining is when the union negotiates a contract as a unit for all workers. So if one person gets it, all people get it. Because what would happen at this point in time was that they would essentially try to play workers off of each other. You would go in there and say, well, I want $5 an hour, and the boss would go, well, I can give him $4 an hour, and you'd have to lower your price. But with collective bargaining, everybody's getting the same thing, so there is no room for breaking. There's no way to break it, if you will. There's no way to break the collective bargaining, or break the union and make someone take less money and so forth. So it was, again, an effective tool that was discovered by the AFL. The third one is the IWW, the International Workers of the World. Why I abbreviated this one on your outline and not the other two, I don't know, but the IWW stands for the International Workers of the World, otherwise known also as the Wobblies. Wobblies, like the Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. The Wobblies were out-and-out socialists. They wanted to spread the doctrine of socialism nationwide, and they believed that all the workers of the world should unite, hence International Workers of the World, IWW. They thought that the union should be as big as possible. It should be all workers of all walks of life, and they should advocate total economic reform, overthrow the government, create socialism. Not communism yet, but socialism. Obviously not successful, since they did not create an international union in which we created socialism, but, still, they did exist during the time period. They were just sort of the wacky one of the group. So, you've got all these unions popping up during this period of time, but the bosses don't like it, for obvious reasons. The bosses fight back by, among other things, banning unions, banning union organizers, beating up workers, refusing to recognize unions and refusing to recognize collective bargaining. So they would show up and say, we have to negotiate as a group. They refused. They just wouldn't do it. They hoped to break the unions in their infancy so that they could not grow and become more powerful. And so as a result, the workers had to adopt different strategies, like strikes. A strike is when you refuse to work in the hopes of forcing the bosses to change their mind about something. In this case, they hoped that by refusing to work, they could force the bosses to recognize their union and give them more power. But it didn't work that way. For example, in the railroad strike of 1877, President Hayes sent in the U.S. Army to break up the strike and beat up the people. which wasn't that uncommon, again, because he argued that the railroad strike threatened the good of the nation, because without railroads we can't produce things or we can't move goods, and so it destroyed our economy. So he argued it was an issue of national security, and that's why he was allowed to use the army. And the public supported him on this. The public generally viewed unions as troublemakers and rabble-rousers, and so as a result, they generally supported efforts by the government to break them up, to keep them under control, and so forth. Another example is the Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot took place in Chicago, and what happened was it was a big union meeting, a big union rally, and someone threw a bomb. To this day, no one's exactly sure what happened, but they think basically it was just an unrelated anarchist, but it didn't matter. The police joined in and started beating people up. It's during the Haymarket Riot also where you see the first appearance of scabs. Scabs are workers who are hired to break a strike. So in other words, if to give you an example, like if all the teachers went on strike but I showed up anyway, that would make me a scab. So a scab is somebody who breaks the strike by showing up to work anyway. Scabs are incredibly unpopular, but businesses love them because, again, it gives them an advantage over the union. The third one, probably the most ridiculously violent one, is the Haymarket Riot. Haymarket Riot was against Carnegie Steel, in which they took over a factory on basically an island in the, I want to say it's the Cuyahoga River, it's near Pittsburgh, whichever it was. They basically took control of a steel factory which was located on an island in the river and fortified it like a military garrison, at which point Carnegie brought in the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were a private detective agency, but functioned a little bit like mercenaries. They were basically like a private army. And that's what happened. You have a private army versus heavily armed strikers who had basically built up a fort, and it turned into an out-and-out warfare. There were hostages taken, people were shot, there were like 13 deaths. This was considered to be probably the worst example of workplace violence up till that point in U.S. history. And there's a lot of people that said that it was what turned Carnegie towards the gospel of wealth. The idea being that men are dying over this, so we can't have this in our society. The only strike that really ended without psychotic amounts of violence is the Pullman strike. It's the one that ends the best. It's in 1894. The Pullman strike is organized by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. These are the guys who work on the railroad in the sleeping cars. A gentleman by the name of Richard Olney. The difference, or the reason why Olney's strike works and the other ones didn't, is because Olney worked on public relations. He appealed to the public and said, look, this is what we're fighting for. We're not doing anything ridiculous. We want just equal rights. We want to be treated well. And so the public understood, and the public pressured the Pullman organization to actually give them what they wanted. So the Pullman strike's the only one of the four that ends without people either losing jobs or getting horribly beaten up or shot. Okay, that takes care of Roman numeral 4. On to Roman numeral 5, immigration in the cities. Whee!